The house hadn't changed much. Same polished floors that creaked just a little on the left side of the hallway. Same chandelier above the foyer, dripping with crystals like it thought it was auditioning for an opera. But it felt colder, as if the air inside held its breath with every step I took. I hadn't been home in 2 years. Kyoto had shaped me, its discipline, its restraint. Over there, silence meant grace. Here, it always meant I wasn't supposed to speak. As I adjusted the silk collar of my blouse in the mirror near the grand staircase, I caught a glimpse of Sophrona, my mother, floating down the hallway in a tailored navy sheath dress. She stopped just short of acknowledging me. "You're not translating tonight," she said flatly. "Just sit. Be present. Be pleasant. No welcome back. No we missed you. Just orders." I followed her into the dining room, where everything shimmered with a sort of forced elegance. Tall taper candles, the good silver, imported white orchids lining the center of the table, like a floral picket fence. My father, Deliverance, stood by the head chair, nodding mechanically as he shook hands with Roxolana, our guest of honor. Roxolana wasn't tall, but she commanded the room like someone who knew she didn't have to raise her voice to be heard. Her kimono was charcoal gray with silver threads running like veins through the fabric. She bowed slightly to me, and I returned it with precision. Juniper, my older brother, leaned against the sideboard, cradling a whiskey glass like it was part of his DNA. He glanced at me, lifted his eyebrows, and smirked. "Look who made it back from cultural exile," he muttered. I ignored him. Talitha, the hired interpreter, stepped forward to mediate the introductions. Her voice was polished, American sweet with rehearsed inflection. She translated as my father praised Roxolana's leadership and the honor of hosting her at our home. Roxolana's responses, soft and layered in her native Kyoto dialect, carried undertones, Talitha trimmed like fat-off meat. My stomach tightened. The first red flag came when Roxolana complimented the home's spatial order, and noted it reflected a certain pride that bordered on rigidity. Talitha translated it into, "She loves how spacious and elegant your home is." No mention of the subtext, none of the edge, just a sugary lie. I watched my father nod proudly, oblivious, or maybe complicit. My eyes drifted to Roxolana, who glanced at me then, the smallest pause in her expression, just enough to know she'd noticed I understood. A Japanese proverb surfaced in my mind. Silence isn't always submission, it's calculation. I remained seated, hands folded in my lap, tracking every shift in tone. Appetizers arrived, seared scallops atop a smear of corn puree. As the staff moved through the room like ghosts, I leaned slightly toward my mother. "The translation's off," I said quietly. Her hand shot out and rested on my forearm, not hard, but firm. Her face remained turned toward Roxolana, smiling. "Don't interfere," she whispered. "We can't afford another scene." "Another scene?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. I leaned back, face composed, but my pulse had kicked up. They wanted me muted. Not because I didn't know what I was hearing, but because I did. Roxolana made another comment, something about heritage transcending geography. Talitha turned it into a bland line about global partnerships. Again, the nuance died in translation. I stared at my father, willing him to notice, to care. He refused to meet my gaze. Juniper, meanwhile, leaned closer to one of the family lawyers seated 2 chairs down, whispered something, and both of them chuckled under their breath. The next 30 minutes blurred in waves of stiff conversation. Every statement from Roxolana came double-wrapped in politeness and strategy. Talitha continued to strip them of meaning, dulling them down to cocktail chatter. I sat still, but my mind ran. Kyoto taught me that listening wasn't passive. It was an active discipline, a hunt for layers. I remembered a tea ceremony where my mentor had said, "To misinterpret is to disrespect." Tonight, Talitha was doing both. My hands itched, my tongue was ready. But I wasn't going to give them what they feared, not yet. Instead, I cataloged every misstep. Every time Roxolana used a metaphor that Talitha flattened into platitude. Every time my brother made eye contact with our father, as if sealing a side agreement. Every time I caught Roxolana's subtle cues, the way she phrased things specifically for someone else in the room. Me. At one point she said, "When trust is worn over the skin, it stains easily." Talitha turned it into, She's excited about our collaboration. I barely hid a smile. Roxolana looked at me directly after that line. Not long, not confrontational, just enough. I gave her the smallest nod. Talitha saw it. Her eyes tightened. A warning passed between us. Hers to me, mine right back. She may have held the mic, but I held the meaning. As the main course was being served, grilled halibut with miso glaze, I kept watching, listening, storing it all. This wasn't a dinner. It was a game board. And I'd finally remembered which piece I was. The scallops had barely been cleared from the table when Roxolana turned her gaze toward me. Her expression didn't shift, but her voice cut clean through the room, soft and sharp all at once. In Kyoto Japanese, she asked, "Have you ever witnessed a promise broken with a smile?" My spine straightened. The question wasn't rhetorical. It was precise, intentional, and meant for me. For a beat, the entire room stalled. Even the clinking of silverware paused mid-air. Talitha glanced nervously at Roxolana, her smile flickering. Then, quickly, she offered her translation. "She says she appreciates your warm hospitality." I stared at her. That was a lie. So clean it almost felt surgical. Roxolana's eyes didn't leave mine. I nodded, just once. "I heard you. I understood." A flash of memory surfaced, sitting cross-legged at a tea ceremony in Gion, the tatami beneath me, unforgiving. My mentor, an older woman with eyes like quiet storms, had said, "A Kyoto question always carries two meanings, one for the room, one for the soul it's meant to strike." The room settled again, as if nothing had happened. Conversation resumed, but I was already somewhere else. Roxolana spoke again, this time about loyalty in business. Her phrasing was deliberate, heavy with formality. Talitha, composed as ever, translated with the grace of a wind chime. "She's asking about long-term cooperation." That wasn't what she asked. What Roxolana actually said was, "Do you trust your future to those who hide their truths behind velvet curtains?" I didn't laugh, but Juniper did. A short, smug sound, like he'd already counted the commission. My fingers curled around the edge of the tablecloth. I replayed her words, carefully threading their layered meaning. This wasn't an inquiry. It was a test. I leaned slightly toward my father. "She's not saying what Talitha's translating," I whispered. Deliverance didn't even look at me. He sipped his wine and said under his breath, "Let the professionals handle this. Don't ruin the mood." My voice was tight. "It's not a mood, it's the deal." "Enough, Alethea." I turned to my mother. She didn't need prompting. She'd been listening. Sophrona reached over, her hand finding my arm like a clamp. Her smile remained perfectly intact as she murmured, "This deal is too big. Don't interfere." She didn't blink, just kept smiling at Roxolana. The words hit harder than any slap. I wasn't surprised. But I felt it. Deep, dull, final. There was no seat at this table for me. Not really. I was here to watch, not to speak. I leaned back, my stomach hollowed out, a slow ache settling. Years of school, the sleepless months in Kyoto, the language mastered syllable by syllable. It was all window dressing to them. Pretty, but disposable. I remembered being 12, interrupting a dinner when I thought Dad had misquoted someone on TV. I'd corrected him. He'd laughed too loud and said, "Sweetie, go help with dessert." Politeness is how power cloaks itself in civility. Roxolana said something else then, about cross-border legacy. Talitha turned it into, "She's hopeful for future alignment." I heard the real line. When a tree is uprooted, the soil that clings reveals what it needed most. My jaw tightened. Roxolana glanced at me again. Just a glance. But it saw me, recognized me. Talitha noticed, and her gaze flicked to mine. Warning. Don't challenge me. I didn't look away. My hands stayed folded, my face calm. But I was already planning, already remembering every line, every mistranslation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate recast of reality, and no one else at this table had the vocabulary to call it out. Talitha spoke again, translating something about shared responsibility. Roxolana had said, "In deals built on borrowed faces, whose mask breaks first?" I shifted in my seat, ready to speak. My mouth opened, then I caught Sophrona's stare from across the table, cold, clear, meant to stop me. And it did. Barely. I closed my mouth, pressed my palms to my thighs. and breathed. They didn't want diplomacy. They wanted docility. Juniper chuckled again. "Our little sister's really soaking this up, huh?" he said loudly enough for the table to hear. Laughter followed. Soft, thin. A ripple of polite condescension. I didn't react, not outwardly, but something shifted inside me. Not anger, not hurt, something sharper. They didn't just underestimate me. They counted on my silence to keep their house in order. I looked at the chandelier above. Its crystals refracted the candlelight like they were always performing, just like the people sitting beneath them. No, I wasn't going to be quiet forever. The moment Roxolana looked at me that way, just a moment, really, everything unraveled. Not outwardly, of course. Outwardly, I smiled, I nodded, I held my wine glass with steady fingers. But inside, that glance cracked open something I'd kept buried for too long. 2 years earlier, I had stood at the same dining room table. Sophrona was arranging place cards for a client dinner, and Deliverance was on a call in the next room. I remember clearly because it was the day I asked to join the family's business development team. Not as a favor. I had the credentials, the language, the cultural understanding. I had earned it. "I want in," I'd said, plain and simple. My father had lowered the phone slightly, raised an eyebrow, and offered that smile. Tight, diplomatic, infuriating. "Maybe after you grow a bit more," he said, like I'd asked for a second helping of dessert, not a seat at the table. That was the last time I saw my name on anything that mattered in our company's internal documents. No calendar invites, no project briefs, not even CC'd on status updates. Later that night, my mother had pulled me aside. "There's an opportunity in Japan," she said, holding her glass of wine like it made the suggestion palatable. "It'll be good for everyone." And just like that, I was shipped off to Kyoto. I thought it was a gift. In Kyoto, I studied harder than I'd ever studied in my life. Language, culture, philosophy, business etiquette. I immersed myself, not for a grade or a degree, but because I believed they'd notice. I thought if I made myself undeniable, they would finally let me in. What I didn't understand until much later was that I had never been sent to learn. I had been sent away. A few months into my stay, I visited the campus mailroom and picked up a forwarded package from home, a quarterly investor packet. Out of curiosity, I flipped through it. Juniper was pictured in a full-page spread about the future of Sterling Holdings. He was quoted extensively. I was never mentioned. The message was clear. The future had been decided. I still remember the email I later found while troubleshooting a shared drive folder Juniper had accidentally opened to my account. It was from my father to the board liaison. "Let her have her cultural phase," it said. "Juniper will run this." I stared at that email for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But something shifted. Kyoto saved me from becoming like them. My host family invited me to dinners where my opinions were heard. My professors handed me responsibilities usually reserved for PhD candidates. I was invited to speak, not once but often, at events where cross-cultural business was discussed. They didn't care about my last name. They cared that I listened well and spoke only when it mattered. One of my mentors said, "We are never more invisible than when we outgrow their version of us." That quote never left me. By the time I returned to Seattle, diploma in hand, I thought the tides might have changed. They hadn't. Deliverance greeted me at the airport with a firm nod and a pre-scheduled Uber. Sophrona's first words when I walked into the house were, "Just in time. We have a dinner next week, big client. I'll need you to smile and be warm." That was it. Not, "Welcome home." Not, "Tell us about Kyoto." Just, "Smile and be warm." And so I smiled. And I was warm. But I took notes. At tonight's dinner, Talitha stumbled slightly over one of Roxolana's honorifics. A subtle but telling sign. I instinctively began to speak, ready to help. Sophrona didn't look at me, but her voice cut in low. "Stay seated." I did. Juniper carried the conversation with all the grace of a high school debate captain. Talking fast, smiling too much, pitching partnerships like they were stock tips, and all of it, every word, felt staged. I started to suspect this dinner was never about securing Roxolana's trust. It was about showcasing Juniper, a performance, and I was merely a prop to remind everyone he had a well-traveled sister who knew her place. I sat there watching, the corners of my mouth turned up just enough, but inside, I was recalling a conversation I had once had in Kyoto. My professor had said, "The greatest danger to power isn't ignorance, it's the quiet witness." Now I understood what he meant. They hadn't banished me for being weak. They banished me because they knew I saw too much. Back at the table, Roxolana spoke again, something about land ownership and invisible signatures. Talitha offered a cleaned-up version, avoiding a phrase that in Japanese clearly referred to clauses buried in annexes. I set down my fork. I didn't speak. Not yet. But in my head, I began a list. Everything Roxolana had said. Everything Talitha had distorted. Every time Juniper exaggerated. Every time Deliverance nodded at a half-truth. Every time Sophrona smiled while pressing my voice back into my throat. They had trained me for diplomacy. They had given me exile. And they thought I'd stayed quiet because I'd surrendered. They were wrong. They buried me in Kyoto. But they forgot something. I grew roots there. The room hadn't cooled. If anything, the tension had congealed into something thicker, harder to swallow. Wine was poured again, and the plates for the main course had just been cleared. A hush settled after Roxolana posed a polite but piercing question about the land registry documentation. "Everything has been notarized and transferred," my father said, casual, his voice so confident it could have been mistaken for truth. "Just as agreed." I stopped breathing for a second. That was a lie, not a stretch of the truth, not a convenient oversight, a blatant fabrication. I knew it because I'd helped prepare the packet weeks ago, painstakingly compiled the summary pages, cross-checked the annexes, even color-coded the outstanding action items. The land hadn't been finalized. We were missing signatures, documents, actual titles. He knew that. Sophrona knew that. I had brought it up just 3 days earlier when I'd noticed 2 transfer deeds were still flagged as placeholder pending resolution. And now here he was, bold-faced, selling fiction at a table of fine china and international prestige. I glanced towards Sophrona. Her face betrayed nothing. Perfectly still, hands folded, mouth relaxed. The performance of respectability. Juniper, across the table, looked bored, occasionally whispering things to Talitha like they were co-conspirators waiting for intermission. While they laughed, I plotted. "I'm going to grab another bottle from the cellar," I said softly, directing it to no one in particular. "Take the 2016 Cabernet from Napa," Sophrona suggested without turning her head. I left the room, not for wine, but with the full intention of confirming what I already knew. Down the hallway, past the family portraits, past the curved staircase and the cold, dark piano room, I turned the brass knob to the study. Locked. Expected. Sophrona didn't like risks, but 2 weeks ago, I'd watched her open it while distracted by a call. The code was the birth year of her mother. I had memorized it like a lifeline. 4 digits later, the lock clicked. Inside, the room smelled like polished leather and stale resolve. I moved quickly. The negotiation folder sat inside the glass cabinet, center shelf, placed as if daring anyone to reach for it. I didn't hesitate. Inside, the packet was thick, pristine, and incomplete. The missing signatures stared up at me. Red-inked annotations, marked as deferred until close. Documents labeled draft only. One entire section marked do not disclose unless asked directly. They were about to close a multi-million-dollar deal based on documents that wouldn't survive a basic audit. And Roxolana, dignified and terrifying in her calm, had asked a direct question that earned a fraudulent answer. I pulled a copy of the flagged appendix, folded it neatly, and slipped it into my blazer. "This isn't a misunderstanding," I muttered under my breath. "It's a setup." I stood still in the room for a beat too long, hands still resting on the cabinet handle. What was I supposed to do? Blow it all open at dinner? Call her out in front of a room where every lie was dressed up in designer silk and sweetened with polite applause? Back in Kyoto, my mentor once said, "It is one thing to lie to win. It is another to lie hoping no one's smart enough to catch you." My family had counted on Roxolana not catching them. But I had. Returning to the dining room, I moved slowly, intentionally. I waited for Deliverance to lift his glass in a mid-toast, then offered, casual as anything, "Was the land registry finalized today? Or is it still in draft like last week's version?" Silence. Half a second too long. Deliverance recovered with a tight laugh. "Of course it's finalized. We followed all protocols." Sophrona didn't blink. "That's not dinner conversation, darling," she said, her voice calm, her smile frozen in place. You're misinformed, Juniper smirked, clearly delighted by the setup. This is why we don't bring legal files to the table, he muttered, loud enough for the lawyers flanking him to catch it. They all chuckled. Even Talitha smiled politely. I felt 12 again. Except this time, I wasn't ashamed. I was taking notes. But I did catch something. Roxalana's eyes, just for a second, narrowed, not in confusion. In recognition, she knew. My fingers itched to throw the document across the table. But no, this wasn't the moment. Not yet. I sat back in my seat and began noting every time Talitha rephrased something to soften the edges. Every misstep, every distortion. You want a war? I thought. Then let's make it quiet and devastating. If they're going to pretend I'm invisible, I whispered internally, then I'll haunt their words. Dinner trickled toward its end with the slow, stiff pacing of a closing argument. No one said what they meant. Everyone postured. My father looked triumphant. Juniper was already texting under the table, probably planning post-deal press. Sophrona was poised like a queen. As the table was being cleared, Sophrona leaned toward me as she passed behind my chair. She didn't sit, she didn't stop, but her whisper reached straight to the center of my spine. One misstep, she said smoothly, and you're out of this family. I didn't respond, I didn't blink, but I closed my fingers more tightly around the folded appendix inside my pocket. I wasn't planning a misstep. I was planning a move. The wine glasses hadn't stopped clinking, but the air had shifted. We'd moved from the dining room into the lounge, that dimly lit space where truths were often spoken through gritted smiles and soft threats. Juniper played host now, swirling a decanter with the grace of a man who thought charm was the same thing as trust. Scotch or Cabernet? He offered with a crooked grin. Roxalana declined both. Water, she said gently. Sophrona leaned in, setting her pearls against her throat with a practiced motion. Your taste for subtle things always impresses me, she cooed, layering honey over steel. I stayed near the far corner, quiet, watching, calculating. That's when I noticed it. The box. It sat to the side of the fireplace, still unopened, wrapped in ivory silk ribbon, no markings, just elegance. It should have been the antique lacquered box I'd carefully sourced from a fifth-generation artisan in Kyoto. It wasn't. The replica had sharper corners, mass-produced. I knew because I had seen the real one that morning, before Sophrona had replaced it. She'll never know, Sophrona had said when I protested. It's about the gesture, not the item. No, I'd thought. In Japan, the item is the gesture. Roxalana hadn't touched the box all evening. I didn't know yet if that was intentional, but I suspected. My gaze didn't leave the gift. Should I call it out now? Or would that be the wrong move? Too loud, too soon. My fingers traced the edge of my glass. The lies weren't even subtle anymore. They were stacked like china. The fake box, the doctored contracts, the staged dinner, and I was supposed to sit in the corner and smile. Juniper poured himself another splash of whiskey. Let's toast again, he announced. To partnership, prosperity, and progress. I stood. It's a shame the original box didn't make it to the table, I said lightly, just loud enough. I thought it represented our intent better. The room froze. Juniper stopped mid-pour. Sophrona turned, too slow to look surprised. You misremember, she said, the coldness hiding in her calm. That's not what was finalized. I signed for the original in Kyoto, I replied evenly. I have the receipt. Silence cracked like glass. Juniper slammed his glass onto the bar. Always playing the smart one, huh? Always needing to prove something. I stayed still, just clarifying what was promised. His voice rose. This is why no one brings you into real conversations. You hijack everything. It's not about you. Sophrona stepped in quickly. Let's not turn this into a scene, she said to no one, to everyone. Not tonight. But the damage was done. Roxalana looked at me, then at the box. She didn't say a word? Juniper scoffed. She's just our translator. She wasn't brought here to negotiate. I didn't flinch. She's always been emotional, Sophrona added, as if explaining an inconvenient stain. This is why we kept her out of the room. She makes things personal. No one jumped in to defend me. Not my brother, not my mother, not my father. I moved to the side table, opened my leather folder, and pulled out the Kyoto receipt, signed, dated, clear. I placed it gently on the coffee table beside the unopened box. I just didn't want us to forget what we said we'd do, I said. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Roxalana, poised as ever, rose from her seat. She walked to the table, picked up the box, examined the edge, then placed it back down. Carefully, deliberately. In my country, she said softly, gift-giving is a reflection of the soul. She turned and gently pushed the box toward Juniper. The air thinned. Even the walls seemed to inhale. Deliverance, for once, said nothing. His eyes tracked Roxalana like a man watching a storm reroute. Sophrona stepped forward, her voice tightening. This is not how family treats family. I faced her. Then stop treating me like the guest who overstayed. There were no raised voices, no yelling, just truth, delivered without apology. I will not stand by while we close deals built on deception, I said, whether it's what we give or what we promise. You're being dramatic, Juniper muttered. She's tired, Sophrona tried. Jet lag. Let's not read too much into it. Roxalana interrupted. I think she's just awake. That landed like a strike. No one responded. I turned, my shoes quiet on the hardwood floor. I didn't look back as I left the room and stepped into the night air. The garden was quiet. No one followed. But I wasn't escaping. I was preparing. I didn't sleep that night, not a single minute. Lying in my old bed, same floral bedding, same ceiling fan with the hum I used to count stars to, I stared into the dark, watching the night stretch out like a question I couldn't answer yet. Every word from that lounge echoed in my head. Juniper's smug dismissal, Sophrona's barbed comments dressed in grace, the quiet way Deliverance chose to say nothing at all. I reached for my notebook, the one I brought back from Kyoto, the one they didn't know I'd kept all this time. I started writing. Not in prose, in facts. Who said what? What wasn't true? What was implied but never admitted? Every tick of the clock felt like a slow beat towards something inevitable. At 2:03 a.m., I opened my laptop. I pulled up every presentation draft Juniper had sent me to review for grammar. That's what he'd always said. Just grammar, Alethea. You're great with wording. What I found in those files wasn't grammar. It was theft. Slide after slide, Juniper had lifted my academic research from Kyoto, my deep dives into conflict resolution, cultural frameworks, negotiation phrasing, and dropped it into his own deck. Not only the concepts, word for word, paragraph breaks intact. My metaphors, my exact bullet points. He'd even kept the formatting, slapped his name on it, and presented it like it was his brainchild. There was a folder labeled Q2 Pitch, Internal Use. I clicked it. Inside, a video of him at a board meeting, presenting the strategy as his own. I spent some time working through negotiation dynamics from an Eastern perspective, he said to the room of shareholders. The key is not translating the language, but translating the silence. My line, my words, and they clapped. They never wanted me silent, I whispered to myself. They wanted me as shadow. As I sifted through the rest of the folders, an auto-forwarded email popped into my inbox, one that wasn't meant for me. From our family's lawyer, the subject, Pre-Disbursement Overview. It was a fund allocation summary, dated before the contract was to be signed. Included in the list, payments marked Anticipated Liability, Incentive Structure Alignment, and one particularly painful line that read, Honorarium Transfer to Suppress Oversight Risk. Right below it, Alethea to be softened by exclusion, contingency filed. I sat there, breath shallow. I wasn't just sidelined, I was a calculated inconvenience, a checkmark on their risk management chart. At 4:17 a.m., I walked into the kitchen barefoot. The tile was cold. I didn't bother turning on the lights. Sophrona stood by the fridge, pouring almond milk into a glass like it was any other night. You were never going to tell me, were you? I said. She didn't look surprised. Tell you what? That Juniper plagiarized my research, that I was officially listed as a risk. She didn't blink. You're emotional. I laughed, just once. A quiet breath. No, I'm awake. That's the difference. Sophrona put the milk down. You're not a victim here, Alethea. You're a wild card. Always have been. You wander off into your little philosophies and expect us to wait around. I worked, I said. I earned every paper, every insight. You used it like wallpaper. You were always your own project. We invested in Juniper. I built the floor you walk on, and you handed it to him." She didn't deny it. She didn't need to. By sunrise, I had screenshots of everything. Emails, slides, audio clips. I backed them up twice. Once to a secure cloud, once to an encrypted drive. I sent an encrypted copy to Naomi, my old mentor in Kyoto. She responded within 20 minutes. "If they've breached cultural protocols, we'll respond through formal channels," she wrote. She added, "You held your silence with dignity, but dignity doesn't mean standing still." By 9:12 a.m., I had finished drafting a memo for Roxolana. I wrote it in both English and Japanese. I outlined the mistranslations, the false documentation, the swapped gift, and the intellectual theft. I didn't accuse. I just presented facts. I signed it, no title, just my name. I labeled it, Clarifications. Mid-morning, I sat in the garden with a cup of green tea, the kind my host mother used to brew. The leaves settled at the bottom of the cup like tiny truths waiting to be stirred. Juniper found me there. He sat down without asking. "You know," he started, "you could have been part of this." "I was." He looked annoyed. "You always needed the credit. That's your problem." I kept my eyes on the cup. "No, I needed integrity. You just needed a mask." He stood. "This thing with Roxolana? You really think you're gonna rewrite history overnight?" "No," I said. "But I'm not letting you write mine." He turned to leave, but just before stepping back inside, he said over his shoulder, "You weren't the only one Dad sent to Kyoto. You were just the first to come back angry." I blinked. The words didn't register at first. What did that mean? I walked quickly to my room, unlocked the encrypted folder Naomi had helped me set up for personal archives. There, among the logs of my coursework, negotiation tapes, and notes from my thesis, was something I hadn't noticed before. A time-stamped document. 3 weeks ago. Accessed from Deliverance's login. I stared at it. There it was. The bridge I thought I had burned was never mine to begin with. They were always playing dirty. I just hadn't played back. Yet, I woke up to the smell of jasmine tea wafting from the kitchen. 2 hours of sleep barely took the edge off, but it didn't matter. My mind had been too loud to rest anyway. I sat up slowly, brushed my fingers across the linen sheets that used to feel like safety, and stared out the window at the Mercer Island skyline. Another perfectly curated day in a house that lived on appearance. Sophrona was already seated when I walked into the kitchen, pristine in a cream sweater set, pearls in place, her tea perfectly steeped. She looked up, smiled as if nothing had happened the night before. "Morning," she said like a script. Juniper wasn't there, but his presence lingered. A folded note on the counter caught my eye. In his handwriting, just 5 words. "Good luck with your initiative." I rolled my eyes, dropped the note in the trash, and walked out. I wasn't in the mood for veiled insults in cursive. Something felt off. Like the air in the house had shifted overnight, charged, but silent. I didn't say a word as I made my way down the hallway to the private office. I needed one last backup copy of my Kyoto memo. The redacted version, the one I'd written without any proprietary information. If I was going to act, I needed every piece of it organized. As I reached for the bottom drawer of the credenza, my knee bumped the side. It slid open slightly. Odd, that drawer was never loose. Inside, tucked beneath a pile of unused file folders, was a small black recorder. Still on. I froze. I clicked play. Juniper's voice came first. Smug, amused from the lounge the night before. Then Sophrona's, cold, careful coaching. It was all there. The mocking, the lies, the manipulation. I set the recorder down gently. It hadn't been hidden from me. It had been planted. The door behind me opened, soft and slow. Sophrona stepped inside like she had rehearsed the timing. "Oh," she said, glancing at the recorder, "you found that." I looked up, holding her gaze. "What is this?" "We had to document the tone," she replied calmly, "in case things got messy." "You recorded me?" "We recorded us," she said, walking past me like we were discussing lunch. "You just happened to be there." Legal positioning. That's what this was. She wasn't worried about what I'd said. She was preparing a narrative. If I pushed, they'd paint me unstable, difficult, erratic. "I won't let you derail your father's legacy," she added, pouring herself a glass of water. "Not over feelings." I stood straighter. "This isn't about feelings. It's about facts, which you clearly knew to protect." Her expression didn't flicker. You were always your own project, Alethea. We invested in Juniper. We planned for him. And I was what? I asked. The intern with the family name? You were complicated. That was the end of it. As she walked out of the room, I stayed frozen. I'd heard enough, but it wasn't the words. It was the realization that every dismissal, every side glance, had been rehearsed. Later that morning, I sat alone at the far end of the breakfast nook. The sun poured in through the windows, far too bright for the mood clamping down on my chest. I remembered, suddenly, a phone call I'd overheard 2 weeks ago. Sophrona speaking softly to the family lawyer. She's going through one of her concern phases again. We can document it if needed, just in case. At the time, I'd brushed it off. Now, it made sickening sense. They weren't just trying to silence me. They were trying to frame me. I opened my laptop and pulled up the timeline I'd been building. Every incident, every inconsistency, every slight. And I sent it to Naomi, my Kyoto mentor. Within hours, she called back. They don't understand, she said flatly. In Japan, cultural distortion for gain is a legal offense. We have avenues. I might need formal testimony, I said. You'll have it. I thanked her, ended the call, and turned to my memo. I rewrote it again, even cleaner. Just facts, no emotion, no insinuation. I attached annotated audio clips, labeled every mistranslation with timestamps, cited the legal gaps. Then I saved 3 versions, uploaded 2 to encrypted storage, 1 I printed. I sent the redacted version to Roxalana's office, subject line, clarification regarding recent meeting. That night, as I stepped outside to clear my head, I heard voices in the garden. Sophrona, on the phone. No, we'll say she overstepped. Emotional instability, long pattern. She's just spiraling. That was it. I walked into the room, calm, controlled. I'm filing a conflict of interest memo to the board. She turned, startled but not surprised. You'd destroy this family? No, I said. You already did. She opened her mouth to respond, but I walked past her, toward the staircase. Toward my laptop, toward my files, toward my plan. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was their liability, and I was done waiting for permission to fight back. The air in the conference room felt staged. Polished wood, leather chairs, imported orchids, Sophrona's signature blend of elegance and intimidation. Deliverance adjusted his tie once, then again. Juniper stood by the projector like a Silicon Valley darling, flashing his curated grin, flipping through a presentation slide deck labeled Vision 2025. I entered last. No greeting, no fanfare, just a sealed envelope in one hand, my tablet in the other. Roxalana sat near the head of the table, perfectly still. Her team flanked her, quiet, unreadable. No one smiled, not even her. As Juniper launched into his opening pitch, Roxalana raised a palm. No English, she said softly, a beat of confusion. Juniper looked to Talitha, who nodded and stepped forward, ready to interpret. But before she could speak, Roxalana cut her off again, this time speaking in crisp Kyoto Japanese. The flowers are fragrant, she said, eyes unmoving, but the soil is sour. Talitha blinked, hesitated, then offered, She's honored by the effort put into today. I stepped forward. That's not what she said. All eyes snapped to me. She said the flowers are fragrant, but the soil is sour, I repeated. It means appearances are pleasant, but the foundation is rotten. Silence dropped like a curtain. Roxalana turned to me, nodded once, then turned back. Juniper laughed nervously. Let's stick to English, yeah. Keep things clear. Roxalana didn't smile. She replied in Japanese. Only what's already clean fears being seen in its native tongue. Talitha froze. I spoke again. She said, only things already clean fear being shown in their own language. Now the room felt colder. Roxalana opened her briefcase, pulled out a thick folder. She laid it on the table and slid it across to Deliverance. These, she said in English now, are transcripts of every email, message, and proposal exchanged over the last 3 months. We've highlighted inconsistencies, omissions, and breaches. Juniper's mouth opened, then closed. And one more, she added. From a side pocket, she drew out a small card, unfolded it. To gift with lies, she read. is to rot the ribbon. To deal with thieves is to soil silk. She placed the card in front of Juniper. Everyone in the room now understood. She had known from the start. Miss Sterling, Roxolana said, turning toward me, you submitted a clarification memo. Please read it, in Japanese first. I nodded. My hands didn't shake as I opened the file. I read through the entire document, every mistranslated phrase, every contract clause that was modified, every portion of my research lifted and repackaged without credit. Then I translated it to English, line by line. Juniper stood. This is a joke. Roxolana lifted her hand. You've had your turn pretending to lead. He sank back down, fists clenched. Sophrona sat motionless, face white. Deliverance looked at me as if I'd shapeshifted into someone he'd never met before. You wanted me invisible, I said quietly, so I wouldn't be a threat. But you taught me everything I needed to be one. No one interrupted again. Roxolana stood. She walked to me, bowed. You have spoken truth without anger, she said in Japanese. That is how peace is preserved. She faced the room. We will not be signing today, but I will be making a separate proposal, privately. Everyone understood. The meeting was over, but not the consequences. The house had gone quiet, but not the kind that brings peace. It was the kind of silence that crawls up your back, heavy with the echo of conversations no one wanted to repeat. Every hallway I walked through felt longer than it used to. The walls held their breath, as if even they knew something irreversible had happened. I could hear muted voices behind closed doors, Deliverance's low growl from the study, Sophrona's clipped tone leaking from the lounge. Juniper was nowhere in sight, which told me he was either scheming or sulking, probably both. I walked back to my room, shut the door, and stared at the Kyoto fan hanging above my desk, a gift from my host mother. Grace before battle, she had called it. Right now, it looked like a reminder not to collapse just because I was finally seen. Downstairs, things were unraveling. You've ruined the family name for a moment of pride, Juniper spat when he finally found me outside the conference room. I didn't ruin anything, I said. I revealed it. He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. Do you even understand what you've done? Every line I read was verifiable. Every claim backed with documentation. You're angry because I didn't let you finish the con. You're so ungrateful, he snapped. We let you in. You used me, I cut in. You stole my work, erased my name, and then tried to spin me into some unstable footnote. He stepped back, ready to argue further, but Deliverance walked in, holding a phone to his ear. He ended the call without a word. It's done, he said. Juniper turned. What do you mean? The deal's gone. Roxolana pulled it. Entirely. I felt the weight of those words settle into the room like a dropped stone. Juniper stood there, blinking. She can't. There were backup terms. There are no backups, Deliverance replied. There's no deal. They both turned toward me. I didn't flinch. A few hours later, I received the call. Miss Sterling, said Roxolana's assistant. She asked me to tell you. She was impressed, but that kind of clarity comes at a cost. I waited. We are withdrawing from all current dealings with Sterling Holdings, effective immediately. I understand. She also asked me to forward your details to our Kyoto consultancy branch. They'd like to speak with you, privately. I thanked her and hung up. The silence afterward was different. Not anxious, not defensive, just still. An hour later, the news broke. Sterling Holdings lost 6 points on the market by sunset. Rumors spread like ivy. Breach of cultural ethics, negotiation malpractice, investor uncertainty. Our PR team scrambled. Statements were drafted, then pulled. Deliverance locked himself in his study again. Sophrona didn't leave the lounge for the rest of the evening. They're blaming her, one housekeeper whispered in the hallway. But she was right, another replied. For the first time in years, the house wasn't aligned against me. It just wasn't aligned at all. That night, Sophrona found me in the foyer. You wanted the truth, she said. Well, here it is. We're no longer a family. No, I answered, calm. We just stopped pretending we ever were. A few hours later, Deliverance called me into the study. He didn't look up as he slid a document across the desk. It was a formal termination of all my executive rights within the company. I already had a copy. My lawyer had reviewed it 2 days earlier. I signed it without hesitation. No drama, no tears, just a name on a dotted line. Afterward, I walked to the guest room. My suitcase was packed. Not requested, just assumed. Sitting atop my folded coat was a sealed envelope. Roxolana's handwriting. I opened it slowly. Inside, a note. Clarity brings loneliness. But in silence, your name echoes longer. Below that, a handwritten message in Japanese, an invitation to become an intercultural strategist in Kyoto. Full position, full autonomy, no family name required. I stepped out onto the porch. The sun had dropped behind the trees. The breeze off the lake was sharp, but refreshing. I held the letter tightly, heart beating slower now. They thought they had pushed me out, but the world I was stepping into, they were never invited. 2 days after Roxolana walked out, the estate looked like it was hosting a funeral. Just not the kind with flowers and condolences. This was a slow death, the kind you feel in the hush of every hallway, the way no one makes eye contact, the way the staff keeps their voices to a whisper. Deliverance had called an internal meeting at dawn. I stood outside the glass door of the legal conference room, listening as he barked instructions with his usual fire, only this time it sounded more like desperation. "Media's calling it a cultural breach," he snapped at Cordelia. "Spin it now or we lose the entire Pacific deal line." Juniper was pacing. Sophrona sat in silence. I stepped in just as Juniper pointed a finger in my direction. This is your fault. You humiliated us in front of legacy clients. You're the reason Roxolana bailed." I didn't raise my voice. "I didn't humiliate anyone," I said. "I told the truth, and the truth embarrassed you." He looked ready to explode. Cordelia opened her mouth to interrupt, but Deliverance beat her to it. "It's done," he said flatly. Juniper turned. "What do you mean?" "The deal's dead. Gone. They've pulled all international activity with us. Effective yesterday." Juniper looked stunned, then furious, then scared. Later that afternoon, as I sat in the study drafting follow-up notes for my own files, my phone buzzed. It was Roxolana's assistant. "She asked me to call you directly," the woman said. "She wanted to thank you and warn you." "Warn me?" She said, "Clarity comes with cost." "I already paid it." The assistant hesitated. "She also asked if you would accept a meeting with our cultural division in Kyoto. Quietly. There's a fund set aside to sponsor a new program, something she believes you should lead." I swallowed hard. "She wants me to build a bridge between two business cultures, with your voice at the center." It wasn't a job. It was a reclamation. And it was mine. That evening, Sophrona found me packing in the guest wing. My things were nearly ready. "I'm asking you one last time," she said, standing in the doorway. "Retract your statement. Say the misunderstanding was yours. We can salvage this." I turned slowly. "You don't get to house what you tried to kill." "We can build the program here," Deliverance said from behind her. "Fund it. Put your name on it." "No, you want to keep it in your hands," I said. "But I've already learned what your hands do." Juniper entered, slow clapping like it was Broadway. "So what now? You'll run off to Japan and play hero with the people who pitied you?" "No," I replied. "I'll work with the people who saw me." He scoffed. Cordelia, stone-faced as ever, stepped in behind them holding a folder. "There are 2 contracts," she said to me. "One releases your executive shares, the other prevents you from using the Sterling name in future ventures." Sophrona added, "We're not trying to hurt you. This is to keep the family clean." "You keep telling yourselves that." I signed both without a blink. Then I handed Cordelia my own envelope. It was addressed to the board. Inside, a detailed statement documenting ethical violations, cultural misconduct, and intentional manipulation. The final line read, "Blood is not a bond. Action is." I zipped the last of my luggage. In the corner, Honora stood with mist in her eyes. "You don't have to go alone," she whispered. "I'm not." She helped me carry my bags to the front entrance. A black car waited at the curb. No one followed me out. But someone had left a small envelope in my coat pocket. My mentor's handwriting. "The hardest truths are the ones spoken when you're finally willing to lose everything." I turned once before getting in the car. They were sitting in the living room. Deliverance staring out the window. Sophrona reading the same page of a book over and over. Juniper nowhere to be seen. Not one of them looked at me. Not one of them said goodbye. That was fine. I wasn't mourning. I was moving forward. The boxes weren't heavy, but they were full. Papers, books, keepsakes I'd brought with me to Kyoto, and now returned with different meaning. I cut open the tape on one of them, peeled back the flaps, and saw the journal I'd kept from my first weeks here. That version of me had been hopeful, almost naive. I wasn't angry at her, just grateful she'd made it this far. Sunlight poured through the narrow window of my new apartment. Not a view of Mercer Island's manicured perfection, but the rooftops of a quiet Kyoto block. Birds outside, a neighbor's child laughing. And for once, silence didn't ask me to shrink. I made my tea slowly, matcha, no sugar, and sat on the floor with my laptop. My mornings now began with order and thought, not tension, not performance, just breathing space and a steady rhythm of work from the consultancy team. People here didn't expect me to apologize for being prepared. Freedom doesn't echo in grand halls, I said aloud to no one. It whispers in small, honest rooms. The consultancy office felt like a different world. Orientation had been smooth, measured, respectful. My coworkers were multilingual, but they let silence sit comfortably between sentences. There was no need to rush, no scramble for dominance, just clarity. During a simulation workshop last week, I introduced a role-play exercise. A Western executive blundered through a mock negotiation, mistaking silence for agreement. One participant asked, "How do you know when to speak up in Japan?" I replied, "When silence starts hiding things." They wrote that down like it was gospel. The next day, I received 2 emails from clients requesting that I personally guide their senior teams. One of my new colleagues smiled and said, "She's our bridge to truth." The words sank into me differently, not like praise, like grounding. Then came the letters. First was from Sophrona. Tidy envelope, no apology. "You always had your own path," she wrote. "We just couldn't follow it." It wasn't remorse. It was resignation. I folded the letter once and set it aside. Juniper's came by email. Subject line blank. "Hope the quiet suits you." I didn't bother to respond. "They still think I'm measuring peace by the volume of applause," I muttered, deleting it without reading the rest. I walked to the train station that weekend to visit my host family. My mother in Kyoto had been waiting with tea ready, slippers at the door. She didn't ask about Seattle, didn't need to. Instead, she handed me a wrapped gift, a fan, similar to the one she gave me years ago. "One for who you were," she said. "One for who you are." I bowed deeply, couldn't speak. Later that evening, we ate in near silence. But it wasn't awkward. It was full. Understood. I didn't have to perform, or prove, or defend. They didn't love me in spite of my voice. They loved me with it. Being understood without translation, that was the real inheritance. Back at my desk, I finalized my first written guide for the consultancy. When words fail, culture speaks. They plan to distribute it across East-West divisions, internal and external. The cover bore only my name, no legacy name, no initials forced on me. It felt correct. "This isn't revenge," I said softly to myself. "It's restoration." I decided not to change my last name. I didn't need to be Sterling anymore. I was done borrowing power from people who never wanted me to keep it. Walking home one afternoon, I stopped by the Kamogawa River and stood there, watching the water move around stones like it knew how to adapt without losing flow. People often mistake letting go for weakness, like holding on, even to something that hurts, somehow means strength. But I wasn't escaping. I was choosing myself over an inheritance built on expectation. "If love has to be earned through silence," I whispered, "it was never love." That night, I left one final voicemail. "Hi, Dad. I'm not angry anymore. Just done." Then I deleted the number from my phone. The stage lights weren't harsh. They were warm, focused, and quiet. The kind of light that didn't demand, but invited. My heels clicked once on the wood before I stood still at the center of the Cultural Leadership Conference in Kyoto. In front of me sat people from across the world. Business leaders, cultural liaisons, students. Some wore headsets for translation. Others sat with notebooks, pens poised, no sterling logos, no boardroom power games, just ears, just listening. I took a breath and let it out slow. Sometimes, I began, to be heard, you must first be disbelieved. No one moved. I continued. In Western business, silence is awkward, a gap to be filled. But where I come from, where I was sent and where I chose to stay, silence holds weight. It is observation, judgment, grace. And when misused, it reveals more than any speech. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. I spoke about cultural dissonance, about transactional translation, about the ethics of intention and the damage of westernizing diplomacy into sales strategy. I used anonymized examples, but the timeline was recognizable. By evening, the headlines had already started. Sterling family under fire for cultural ethics breach. I hadn't shouted, I hadn't accused. I had simply shared what happened when trust was treated as a tactic. Within 48 hours, Seattle corporate media had picked it up. Deliverance was asked to step down from his position as CEO. Public pressure and internal dissent forced the board to act quickly. Juniper's image began surfacing, footage from past pitches, moments where he'd repeated phrases I had first published. One clip showed him presenting strategic silence as a cross-cultural tactic, a direct quote from my Kyoto thesis. Sophrona disappeared from social media. Her once favored charities released quiet statements distancing themselves from Sterling Holdings. And me? I received a letter. Not signed by any of them, but stamped by the Sterling board, a formal apology, an acknowledgement of misalignment of credit and contribution. It wasn't for show. It was legal, permanent. Back in Kyoto, my consultancy's inbox exploded with invitations. I was asked to help design an ethics curriculum for US-based firms expanding into Asia. My phone buzzed with messages. Thank you for showing us how to fight without screaming. Your silence was the loudest sound I've heard. One morning, I walked into a bookstore near my apartment. I wasn't expecting anything. I just wanted tea and to browse quietly. But there it was. My face. On the cover of a book titled, Bridging Without Bending. I hadn't known the publisher had moved this fast. Inside, I found a single copy had already been signed, by the editor, with a note. Your silence taught us more than any boardroom speech ever did. A young girl tapped my arm. She looked no older than 20. Are you her? She asked. I nodded. She handed me the book. Was it worth losing your family? I smiled gently. I didn't lose them, I said. I found myself. Weeks later, I found out the Mercer Island estate had been listed for sale. Too much heat, too much exposure, too many ghosts. Some things weren't worth keeping. The final scene played out the way I wouldn't have scripted, but maybe the way it had to. Deliverance, now retired, sat alone in what used to be his study, watching a video of my speech. Not angry, just quiet. Honora entered the room. She didn't say anything, just placed a copy of my book beside his chair and walked away. They taught me silence, I whispered to myself that evening. I taught the world to listen. At the close of the conference, I stood once more on the stage, bowed slowly, and the applause came. Not wild, not eruptive, but solid, like truth, no translation needed.